In September 1979, 47-year-old Daniel Pritchard vanished while photographing abandoned mining equipment in the mountains outside Silver Creek, Montana. His truck was found 3 days later on a Forest Service road, camera bag inside, film still loaded. Despite an exhaustive search involving over 200 volunteers, no trace of Daniel was ever discovered. The case went cold within 6 months. Nearly 43 years later, in March 2022, genetic genealogy traced DNA from a single cigarette butt found near Daniel's truck to a family tree that led investigators to someone who had been part of the original search party. The arrest sent shockwaves through Silver Creek, a town of 8,000 where everyone knew everyone. What made the case particularly haunting was not just who was arrested, but how thoroughly this person had embedded themselves in the Pritchard family's grief for over 4 decades, attending every anniversary vigil, every fundraiser, every moment of mourning. If this story speaks to you, please subscribe to our channel. We bring forgotten victims back into the light, one case at a time. Your subscription helps us continue this important work. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the Montana State Crime Lab, staring at a printout that seemed impossible. The DNA profile from evidence item 794418, a cigarette butt collected 43 years ago from a dirt turnout near Daniel Pritchard's abandoned truck, had finally yielded results through forensic genealogy. Not a direct match in CODIS, but something potentially better. A third cousin match in a public genealogy database. She had spent 6 weeks building the family tree with the help of a genetic genealogist in California. Branch by branch, generation by generation, they had worked backward and forward through birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, obituaries. The tree had over 400 people on it now, and every branch led back to one place: Silver Creek, Montana. Chen called the Silver Creek Sheriff's Office. When Sheriff Mike Torres answered, she could hear the doubt in his voice immediately. He had been a deputy back in 1979, fresh out of the academy, part of the massive search for Daniel Pritchard. Now, after 42 years in law enforcement, he thought he had seen everything. "You're telling me we have viable DNA from 1979? Torres said. "That cigarette butt was in an evidence locker for 4 decades. It was stored properly, dry, cool, sealed. The DNA degraded, but we got enough markers for a genealogy search," Chen explained. "And Sheriff, the tree leads to someone local, someone who would have been in their 20s in 1979. There was a long silence. "Send me the name." When Chen emailed the file, she waited on the line. She heard Torres open it. Then she heard him exhale slowly, the way people do when the ground shifts beneath them. "That's not possible," he said quietly. "That's absolutely not possible." "Why?" "Because I know this person. I've known them my whole life. They helped search for Daniel. They were there every single day, organizing volunteers, bringing food to the search teams. They were at the funeral. They visit the memorial every year." Chen had heard this before. The killer in the search party, the murderer at the funeral. It was a pattern, a particular kind of psychological profile. But hearing it confirmed still sent ice down her spine. "We need to move carefully," she said. "I need you to pull every piece of evidence from that case, every witness statement, every photograph from the search, every tip that came in. And I need to know exactly where this person was on September 15th, 1979. Silver Creek, Montana, 1979, was the kind of place where the mountains pressed close and the sky seemed vast. The town existed because of copper. 2 generations of men had pulled ore from the earth, and when the mines began to close in the late 70s, the town's future became uncertain. People who had spent their whole lives there began to wonder if their children would stay or leave for bigger cities with better opportunities. Daniel Pritchard had lived in Silver Creek for 23 years. He was born in Chicago, studied photography at the Art Institute, spent the early 60s in New York trying to make it as a magazine photographer. He shot fashion, architecture, street scenes. He was good, but not great, talented, but not transcendent. In 1956, he married Virginia Walsh, a librarian from Queens. They wanted children, but it never happened. They wanted a quieter life. In 1956, they found Silver Creek. Daniel took a job as the staff photographer for the Silver Creek Recorder, the local weekly paper. Virginia got a job at the town library. They bought a small house on Copper Street with a darkroom Daniel built in the basement. They adopted a rhythm. Daniel shot everything worth documenting in Silver Creek, and Virginia cataloged the town's history in books and archives. They were childless, but they were rarely lonely. Daniel's specialty became what he called the disappearing. He photographed the old mining equipment before it was hauled away for scrap, the abandoned smelters before they collapsed, the houses left empty when families moved away. He had hundreds of these photographs. He developed them carefully, printed them on quality paper, filed them in archival boxes. He saw himself as documenting a moment in time, preserving what would otherwise be forgotten. "Someone has to remember," he told Virginia. "Someone has to show that this all meant something." The other thing Daniel loved was cameras themselves, not just using them, but understanding them, fixing them, bringing them back to life. In the basement, next to his darkroom, he had a workbench covered with old cameras in various states of repair. Rangefinders from the 40s, box cameras from the 20s, even a few large format cameras from the turn of the century. He bought them at estate sales, found them in antique shops, accepted them from elderly residents who remembered them gathering dust in attics. He cleaned the lenses, unstuck the shutters, replaced the leather bellows, polished the brass. Then he would load film and actually use them, testing whether his repairs worked. Virginia's favorite photograph of him showed Daniel at his workbench, magnifying glass in hand, a Kodak autographic from 1917 spread out in pieces before him. His face held absolute concentration, the look of someone solving a puzzle that mattered. On Friday, September 14, 1979, Daniel came home from the recorder office around 4 in the afternoon. Virginia was making pot roast, her Friday tradition. Daniel kissed her cheek, washed his hands, told her he was going out the next morning. "There's an old stamp mill up on the Rattlesnake Creek Road," he said. "Been abandoned since '72. I heard they're bringing a crew in next week to knock it down. I want to get photos before it's gone." Virginia knew this routine. Daniel would leave early, hike in with his equipment, spend hours getting the light right, come home around midday. She had learned not to worry. He was careful, methodical, experienced. "Take water," she said, "and the walkie-talkie." "I always do," he said. They ate dinner together. They watched The Dukes of Hazzard, which Daniel found ridiculous, but Virginia enjoyed. Around 10, they went to bed. Daniel set his alarm for 5:30. He wanted to catch the early morning light, that golden hour when everything looked softer and more forgiving. Saturday morning, September 15th. Daniel woke before his alarm. He dressed quietly so Virginia could sleep. Jeans, flannel shirt, hiking boots. He made coffee in the percolator, poured it into his thermos, made himself 2 sandwiches. In the basement, he packed his camera bag, his Nikon F2, 3 lenses, light meter, a dozen rolls of Tri-X film, lens cloth, notebook, and pencil. The bag weighed maybe 15 pounds. He had carried it hundreds of times. He also grabbed his newest restoration project, a 1924 Graflex Speed Graphic he had just finished repairing. The camera was massive, all wood and brass and leather, the kind newspaper photographers used in the 20s and 30s. Daniel had found it at an estate sale in Butte, paid $20 for it, spent 2 months getting it working again. He wanted to test it, to see if his repairs held up. At 6:15, as the sky turned from black to deep blue, Daniel backed his 1976 Ford F-150 out of the driveway. The truck was dark green, dented, reliable. The camera bag sat in the passenger seat. The Graflex, wrapped in a cloth, rode between them. Virginia heard the truck start, heard it pull away. She turned over in bed and went back to sleep. It was the last time she saw her husband. The drive to Rattlesnake Creek took 40 minutes. The road started paved, turned to gravel, eventually became just 2 ruts through pine trees. Daniel had driven it before. He knew where the stamp mill was, had scouted it a week earlier. Around 7 o'clock, he parked the truck on a wide spot next to a turnout, locked it, shouldered his camera bag, and started walking. The mill sat about half a mile off the road, in a clearing that had once been bustling with workers and machinery. Now it was silent, except for wind and birds. The building itself was 3 stories of weathered wood and rusted metal, slowly collapsing inward. The stamp mechanisms, huge iron weights that had crushed ore, still stood inside like sleeping giants. Daniel spent an hour circling the building, studying angles, watching how the light moved. He shot 2 rolls with the Nikon, capturing the decay, the way nature was reclaiming the space, the melancholy beauty of abandonment. Then he set up the Graflex on its tripod, loaded a sheet of film, composed a shot through the ground glass viewfinder. The camera worked perfectly. The shutter fired with a solid thunk. Daniel smiled. All those hours at his workbench, and now this 100-year-old machine was creating images again. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the footsteps behind him until they were very close. Virginia woke around 9, made herself breakfast, did some gardening. The day was warm, the sky cloudless. She expected Daniel home by noon, maybe 1 o'clock at the latest. When 2 o'clock came and went, she felt the first flutter of worry. When 3 o'clock arrived, the worry became concern. By 4, she called the sheriff's office. Deputy Mike Torres took the call. He was 23 years old, eager, thorough. He told Virginia that adults had the right to be late, that Daniel was probably just getting good shots and losing track of time. But something in Virginia's voice made him take it seriously. She wasn't a worrier. She didn't call for nothing. "Give me the location," Torres said. "I'll drive out there, make sure his truck is where it should be." Virginia told him about Rattlesnake Creek, the old stamp mill, the Forest Service Road. Torres said he would call her back within the hour. He found Daniel's truck at 5:30. It sat in the turnout exactly where Virginia said it would be, driver's door unlocked, keys in the ignition. The camera bag was in the passenger seat, unopened. Daniel's thermos sat in the cup holder, still half full of cold coffee. His wallet was in the glove compartment, along with his registration and insurance papers. Torres got out of his patrol car, called Daniel's name. His voice echoed off the trees and died away. He walked to the truck, looked inside, touched nothing. Then he walked up the trail toward the stamp mill, calling out every 30 seconds, listening for a response that never came. At the mill, Torres found the Graflex camera on its tripod, positioned to photograph the building's collapsing west wall. The camera was undamaged, film still inside. Nearby, he found Daniel's notebook, open to a page where he had written notes about light and exposure. A lens cap lay in the dirt, but no Daniel. Torres called it in. Within 2 hours, search and rescue teams were mobilizing. Within 4 hours, over 60 volunteers were combing the forest around the stamp mill. They searched until darkness forced them to stop, and they resumed at first light the next morning. The search lasted 9 days. Over 200 people participated at various times. They worked in grids, covering every inch of forest within a 3-mile radius of the mill. They brought in dogs, helicopters, even a psychic that someone's aunt swore by. They found nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle, no indication of where Daniel Pritchard had gone. The only potential evidence was that cigarette butt found in the dirt turnout near Daniel's truck. It was a Marlboro Red, smoked down to the filter, left next to a tire track that didn't match Daniel's Ford. Someone had been there. Whether they had anything to do with Daniel's disappearance was impossible to say. The investigation dragged on for months. Police interviewed everyone who knew Daniel, everyone who had been in the area that weekend, everyone who had any connection to the stamp mill or the Forest Service roads. They developed no leads, no enemies, no debts, no affairs, no reason for Daniel to disappear voluntarily. He was a 47-year-old photographer with a wife he loved and a life he valued. He had no reason to vanish. By March 1980, the case was officially cold. The file went into storage. Virginia Pritchard became a widow without a death certificate, waiting for a husband who never came home. Among the volunteers who searched for Daniel with particular dedication was a man named Robert Hayward. He was 26 years old in 1979, worked at the Silver Creek lumber mill, lived in a small rental house on the east side of town. He was quiet, reliable, known for keeping to himself, but always willing to help when help was needed. Robert showed up on the second day of the search and stayed every day until it ended. He took vacation time from the lumber mill. He organized other volunteers, brought coffee and sandwiches, worked the most difficult terrain without complaint. At night, he would stop by the Pritchard house to update Virginia on the search progress, to offer comfort, to promise they would keep looking. "We're not giving up," he told her. "We're going to find him." Virginia remembered Robert's kindness. So did everyone else in Silver Creek. When the search ended without finding Daniel, Robert was among those who felt the failure most deeply. He attended Daniel's memorial service. He donated money to a scholarship Virginia set up in Daniel's name. Every year on September 15th, he would visit the memorial stone that Virginia placed at the stamp mill site, leaving flowers, standing in silence. For 43 years, Robert Hayward was known as one of the good ones, someone who had tried his hardest to bring Daniel Pritchard home. Detective Chen arrived in Silver Creek on a Tuesday morning in late March 2022. She met Sheriff Torres at his office, where the entire Daniel Pritchard case file now covered a conference table. Evidence boxes, witness statements, photographs from the search, maps marked with grid patterns. "Walk me through the cigarette butt," Chen said. Torres pulled out the evidence log. Founded on September 17, 1979, 2 days after Daniel vanished. Deputy Collins was doing a detailed sweep of the turnout where Daniel's truck was parked. The cigarette was in the dirt about 15 feet from the truck, partially buried. Could have been there for hours, could have been there for weeks. We had no way to know. Did you test it at the time? We noted blood type from the saliva, but that was the extent of forensics in 1979. Type O positive, which is 40% of the population, useless for identification. Who smokes Marlboro Reds in this investigation? Torres opened a notebook. We asked everyone we interviewed. In 1979, about 30% of adults smoked. Of those we interviewed, maybe 20 people smoked Marlboros specifically, including Robert Hayward. Chen felt something shift. He was a smoker? Chain smoker back then. Quit in the 90s, I think. But yeah, Marlboro Reds were his brand. I remember because he was always bumming cigarettes during the search when he ran out. Did anyone think that was significant? Dozens of people were at that turnout over those 9 days. Search teams parked there. Volunteers gathered there. Media showed up. Finding a cigarette butt proved nothing. Robert was there legitimately, along with everyone else. Chen opened her laptop, pulled up the genealogy report. The DNA from that cigarette built a family tree. Third cousin matched to someone in Oregon, which led to a great-great-grandmother named Margaret Hayward, born in 1887 in Missouri. Her descendants spread across Montana, Idaho, Oregon. One of those descendants is Robert Hayward, age 69, resident of Silver Creek. Torres was quiet for a long time. Robert organized the searches. He brought food. He comforted Virginia. He's been visiting Daniel's memorial for 43 years. That's the pattern, Chen said, inserting themselves into the investigation, feeding off the family's grief, reliving the crime through the search. It's not uncommon. But why would Robert kill Daniel? They barely knew each other. Robert worked at the lumber mill. Daniel was a photographer. Different circles, different lives. That's what we need to find out. They started with Robert's background. Born in Silver Creek in 1953, raised by a single mother after his father died in a mining accident, graduated high school in 1971, got a job at the lumber mill that same year, worked there until retirement in 2018. Never married, no children, no criminal record. He was a member of the volunteer fire department, the Elks Lodge, the Silver Creek Historical Society. He was, by every measure, an ordinary citizen. But Chen had learned that ordinary lives could hide extraordinary secrets. She requested Robert's employment records, his financial history, his medical files. She interviewed people who had known him in 1979, asking careful questions without revealing why she was asking. The picture that emerged was of a man who was present but never central, helpful but never intimate. He had acquaintances but no close friends. He dated occasionally but never seriously. He seemed content with his routine: work, home, volunteer activities, repeat. One detail caught Chen's attention. In 1978, a year before Daniel vanished, Robert had taken a leave of absence from the lumber mill for 3 months. The reason given was a family emergency in Idaho. Chen tracked down Robert's supervisor from that time, now retired and living in Missoula. "I remember that," the supervisor said over the phone. "Robert's mother was sick, I think. Cancer or something. He went to take care of her. Came back in the fall, quiet as ever. Went right back to work." But when Chen checked death records, Robert's mother hadn't died until 1985, 7 years after Robert's leave of absence. She made a note to investigate further. The other significant detail was photographic. The sheriff's office had hundreds of pictures from the 1979 search, taken by the recorder staff and various volunteers. Chen went through them methodically, marking every photo that showed Robert Hayward. In every image, Robert was present, but peripheral, carrying supplies in the background, standing with a group of searchers, helping load equipment into trucks. But in one photo, taken on the 4th day of the search, Robert stood alone at the turnout where Daniel's truck had been parked. The truck was gone by then, impounded as evidence. Robert stood in the empty space, hands in pockets, looking at the camera with an expression that was hard to read. Not grief, not determination. Something else. Something almost satisfied. Chen showed the photo to a forensic psychologist who specialized in criminal behavior. The psychologist studied it for several minutes. "This is someone reliving the event," she said, standing where the victim was last seen, mentally reconstructing what happened. It's not unusual for killers who involve themselves in searches. They're compulsively drawn back to the scene. Can we prove anything from a photograph? No, but combined with DNA evidence, it builds a profile. By mid-April, Chen had enough for a warrant. She needed to collect a direct DNA sample from Robert Hayward to confirm he was the source of the DNA on the cigarette butt. But they had to be careful. If Robert was indeed responsible for Daniel's disappearance, he had successfully hidden it for 43 years. He was patient, careful, intelligent. They would get one chance to do this right. Sheriff Torres suggested a ruse. The Silver Creek Historical Society was doing a genealogy project, documenting family trees of longtime residents. They would approach Robert as part of that legitimate project, ask for a DNA sample for their database. It wasn't entirely honest, but it was legal. On April 22, 2022, a volunteer from the Historical Society knocked on Robert Hayward's door. He lived in the same small house he had rented in 1979, though he had purchased it in the 90s. The house was tidy, sparsely furnished, filled with books and old photographs. Robert agreed to the DNA sample without hesitation. He swabbed his own cheek, sealed the sample in the provided envelope, handed it over with a smile. "Always happy to help preserve local history," he said. The sample went to the state lab with a rush priority. 5 days later, the results came back. The DNA from the cigarette butt found near Daniel Pritchard's truck in 1979 was a match to Robert Hayward, with a probability exceeding 99.9%. Chen and Torres sat in the sheriff's office, looking at the report, both feeling the weight of what came next. "We still don't have a body," Torres said. "We don't have a weapon. We don't have a witness. We have a cigarette butt from 43 years ago found at a location where Robert had every legitimate reason to be." "We have enough for an arrest," Chen said. "And once we arrest him, we can search his property. We can interview him. We can see if 43 years of keeping this secret has left any cracks we can exploit." On May 3, 2022, they arrested Robert Hayward at his home. He was in his kitchen making coffee when they knocked. He opened the door in his bathrobe, saw the sheriff and the detective and the patrol cars in his driveway, and his face went very still. "Robert Hayward," Torres said, "you're under arrest for the murder of Daniel Pritchard." Robert didn't ask why. He didn't proclaim innocence. He simply nodded and said, "I'd like to get dressed first." They let him, with an officer standing in the bedroom doorway. Robert changed into jeans and a button-up shirt, moving slowly, carefully, as if this were just another ordinary morning. Then he held out his hands for the handcuffs. At the sheriff's office, Robert waived his right to an attorney, which immediately raised red flags for Chen. People who waive their rights usually want to talk, want to explain, want to justify. Robert did none of those things. He sat in the interrogation room, hands folded on the table, face expressionless, and waited. "Robert," Chen began, "we found your DNA on a cigarette butt at the scene where Daniel Pritchard disappeared in 1979. Can you explain that?" "I smoked back then," Robert said. "I was part of the search. I was at that turnout many times. This particular cigarette was found before the search started. It was collected on September 17th, but it had been there longer, buried in the dirt. Our forensic analysis suggests it was there on or around September 15th. Robert said nothing. "Robert, you were at that turnout on September 15th, before anyone knew Daniel was missing. How?" Still nothing. Torres leaned forward. "Robert, I've known you my whole life. You helped search for Daniel. You comforted his wife. You've been visiting his memorial for 43 years. If something happened that day, if it was an accident, now is the time to tell us." For the first time, Robert's face changed. A flicker of something. Amusement, contempt, maybe satisfaction. It wasn't an accident, he said quietly. Chen felt her heartbeat quicken. What happened? I saw him there, at the stamp mill, with his cameras, taking pictures of things that were dying, things that were being torn down. He loved that, recording the end of things. Robert paused. I asked if I could help him carry equipment. He said yes. We talked for a while. He told me about his photographs, his project to document everything that was disappearing. He was very passionate about it. And then? I asked if I could see his darkroom sometime. He said, of course, anytime. He was friendly, trusting. Robert smiled, thin and cold. That was his mistake. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Robert didn't confess to the specific details of how Daniel died, didn't reveal where he had hidden the body, but he confirmed enough for Chen to understand what had happened. Robert had followed Daniel to the stamp mill that morning, had approached him under friendly pretenses, had attacked him when Daniel's back was turned. The why remained murky. Robert suggested it was about the cameras, about Daniel's collection, about wanting something that Daniel had. But Chen suspected it was darker than that. It was about power, about taking something from someone who had everything. A wife, a purpose, a life that mattered. Robert had none of those things. In his isolation and resentment, he had decided Daniel didn't deserve them either. The search of Robert's property revealed Daniel's cameras, all of them, stored in a locked shed behind Robert's house, organized on shelves, maintained with obsessive care. The Nikon F2, the 3 lenses, even the 1924 Graflex Speed Graphic. 43 years after Daniel's disappearance, his cameras sat in perfect condition, a collection Robert had kept like trophies. They also found photographs, hundreds of them, shot on Daniel's own cameras with Daniel's own film, developed in what appeared to be Daniel's own techniques. Photographs of Silver Creek, of abandoned buildings, of the disappearing world Daniel had loved to document. Robert had taken Daniel's project and made it his own, continuing it for 4 decades, using Daniel's tools, mimicking Daniel's style. It was the most disturbing thing Chen had ever seen. A killer not just taking a life, but assuming it, living inside it, pretending to be the person he had murdered. The search for Daniel's body continued. Based on terrain analysis, ground-penetrating radar, and careful study of the geography around the stamp mill, investigators focused on an area of abandoned mine shafts about 2 miles from where Daniel had parked his truck. On June 14, 2022, they found him. The mine shaft was vertical, about 40 feet deep, partially filled with water and debris. Daniel's remains were at the bottom, along with his wallet, his watch, and his wedding ring. The forensic pathologist determined that he had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely struck from behind while he worked at his camera. Virginia Pritchard was 89 years old when they found her husband. She had lived 43 years not knowing what had happened, holding on to hope that became thinner with each passing year, but never quite vanishing. When Sheriff Torres came to her door to tell her they had found Daniel, she sat down on her sofa and wept. "Can I have his cameras back?" she asked when she could speak again. "After the trial," Torres said gently. "They're evidence now." "He loved those cameras more than almost anything," Virginia said. "He spent hours fixing them, bringing them back to life. And someone took them. Someone kept them. We'll get them back to you," Torres promised. "Daniel will come home, and his cameras will too." The trial of Robert Hayward began in February 2023. He was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and theft. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the cameras found in Robert's shed, the photographs taken with Daniel's equipment. They brought in genealogists to explain how the family tree was built, forensic experts to confirm the DNA match, psychologists to profile Robert's behavior. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that Robert's presence at the turnout was explained by his participation in the search, that the cameras could have been purchased or found rather than stolen. But the argument fell apart when the prosecution showed that the Graflex speed graphic, the camera Daniel had just finished restoring, had Daniel's fingerprints inside its casing, along with Robert's. There was no legitimate way for Robert to have that camera except by taking it from Daniel. The most powerful testimony came from Virginia Pritchard. At 90 years old, she walked slowly to the witness stand, sat down, and looked directly at Robert Hayward. "You came to my house," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. "The day after Daniel disappeared, you brought me soup. You told me you would keep searching. You told me you would bring him home. And you knew the whole time exactly where he was. You knew because you put him there." Robert looked at her with that same thin smile, that same cold satisfaction. "Every September 15th for 43 years, you visited his memorial. You left flowers. You stood there and pretended to mourn, and the whole time, you had his cameras in your shed. You were using his equipment, taking his photographs, living his life." Virginia paused, tears running down her face. "Why? What did Daniel ever do to you?" Robert said nothing. He never explained, never justified, never showed remorse. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and found him guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave Robert Hayward life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert, now 70 years old, would die in prison, just as he had let Daniel die in a mine shaft 43 years earlier. "You didn't just take a life," the judge said. "You took a family's peace. You took a wife's closure. You took 43 years of truth and replaced them with lies. And then you had the audacity to perform grief, to pretend humanity you clearly don't possess. This court finds your actions irredeemable." After the trial, Virginia retrieved Daniel's cameras. She donated most of them to the Silver Creek Historical Society, where they were displayed with a plaque explaining Daniel's life and work. But she kept the Graflex speed graphic, the camera Daniel had been so proud of restoring. She kept it in her living room, sitting on a table next to a photograph Daniel had taken of her in 1978, both of them smiling, neither knowing how little time they had left. Virginia died in November 2023, 18 months after Daniel was found. She was buried beside him in the Silver Creek Cemetery, the headstone finally complete with both their dates, the story no longer open-ended. The case of Daniel Pritchard stands as a reminder of a particular kind of evil, the evil that masquerades as kindness, that inserts itself into tragedy not to help, but to control, to watch, to feed off the grief it created. Robert Hayward wasn't a stranger who killed impulsively. He was something worse, a predator who took satisfaction not just in the act of murder, but in the aftermath, in the performance of innocence, in watching a family suffer while pretending to comfort them. For 43 years, he succeeded. But in the end, a cigarette butt he had smoked and discarded, a moment of carelessness in 1979, became the thread that unraveled everything. DNA from a different era, preserved through luck and proper storage, analyzed through modern technology, traced through generations of family trees, finally spoke truth. Daniel Pritchard was a photographer who believed in preserving memory, in showing that everything matters, that nothing should be forgotten. In death, he became proof of his own philosophy. His case was not forgotten. His life was not erased. Justice, delayed by 4 decades, finally arrived. And Robert Hayward, who thought he had committed the perfect crime, learned that no crime is perfect, no secret is truly safe, and that the past never stays buried forever. They